I'll edit that out. That was me just checking the lighting. I wanted to talk today about inks and stamping and all the other things, because at the moment we are bombarded with different types of ink. And I'm not really a card maker or a scrapbooker. I'm really more at the fine art end of the scale, who does occasional mixed media, and occasionally I will make cards, mostly because I'm turning things I've painted into a card, or I want to make a card for a friend that is special. So maybe, for example, I have a friend who recently got a research grant to work on fish, and I'm going to be making him a card with some fish on it to say congratulations, and I'll be doing that in a few weeks' time when the bloody thing arrives from the USA. In the meanwhile, I wanted to talk about some of the different inks that are out there and compare how they work. So many of you have really liked my colour chemistry series for explaining to you how paint works. This is the colour chemistry for stampers. First we have Archival. Archival comes from Ranger in the USA, and Archival is, as far as I'm concerned, one of my favourite inks, because it will go on anything, first of all, and you never have problems with Archival. If you use it properly, it's absolutely fine. It's a solvent-based ink, effectively. It's an oil-based ink. It is archival quality, hence the name, and it comes in loads of colours. There's the standard Ranger ones, and then there's Wendy Vecchi's range of beautiful coloured ones. It's a good all-rounder, and it's great, and I'll show you that in a minute. In terms of the other main black ones, that's a dye ink. Pigment ink, VersaFine, is a really high quality fine detail pigment ink, which I really like, and I'll be showing you that in a minute. There is another black from Soot that make VersaFine, which is VersaColor, which is just not quite so fine quality, and we'll compare those directly so you can see it. There is also VersaMagic, which is a chalk ink, and that will go on all sorts of surfaces, and I'll show you that too. Soot also make Brilliance, which is a really fast drying pigment ink, some of which are a little bit pearlescent. Not that one, but some are. And the nice thing with VersaColor is it comes in all sorts of colours, like silver. I used it recently in a painting that was pretty popular, an acrylic work I did. They make VersaCraft, which is suitable for wood, paper and fabric, but we'll also compare that. And I'm trying to get most of these out in blacks, browns or other dark colours, because that makes it easier for you guys when you're watching this to actually make a direct comparison of them. That chalk ink that I have, VersaMagic, actually, that's in Pink Petunia. I'm going to change that for Hint of Pesto, which is darker, just so we're comparing apples and apples. VersaColor comes in, there's mini pads, the mini cubes. It also comes in full-size pads and multicolour pads, just so you know. And I really like it, you know, it's a really good quality pigment ink, much better than store-own brand kind of ones. There is a proper solvent ink, Stays On. Some people call it Staz On, but I'm assured it's Stays On. Also by Soot. Comes in colours, black, white and metallics really. And this is the copper, and it's a very special one because you have to re-ink it every time you use it. But we'll also show you that one towards the end. There is also Memento, which people use often with alcohol markers, which comes in full-size pads, and these dewdrops. I love these. They are really economical. I will link to them in the video description, and we'll compare how they work. What I will say about Memento for working with alcohol markers is that actually Archival also works with alcohol markers as long as you dry it with a heat tool first, so you don't need to have both of them, which many people think you do need both of them. I'm not even going to get into embossing inks like Versamark and so on, because that's really beyond the scope of this. What I want to do is compare these with each other on both rubber and clear stamps, so that we can see how different they are. And I'm going to use and of course we have Distress as well. I mean, Distress is not actually meant for stamping, but I'm pretty sure I have got the black soot to hand somewhere. Let's see if I have, because it would be good, wouldn't it, if we actually did a proper comparison with Distress. Distress does stamp, kind of, but it's not great, I will be honest. But it isn't meant to be. It's meant to be for special effects. And I think that's something many people miss. So there we have black soot in Distress. And Distress comes in these full-size pads and these mini pads. Personally, I think the mini ones are better because you can fit more of them in a drawer. You don't need the large ones. So I'm stamping on a really high-quality cardstock. It's not Nina Solar White Classic Crest, but it is a good one. Stamping over a sheet of fun foam. First set of stamps that I'm going to be demonstrating with, I wanted some that had a reasonable amount of solid area, but also a bit of detail, and they are from the Papillon set by Tim Holtz, just for Stampers Anonymous, which are these ones. It's the Papillon set CMS 106, and I will link to that in the video description. It's a real favourite set of mine, and I'm using this set of 3 butterflies and moths, which stamp really, really well usually. We'll see how we go today. Always use a block suitable for size for your stamps, and try and mount it in the middle if you can. It stops you rocking it, which is a common reason for blurry edges. Now I'm just going to label up this sheet with what we're going to compare, and we'll pop them all on. So I'm going to do Archival, VersaFine, VersaMagic, VersaCraft, Brilliance, VersaColor, Memento, and Distress. And I'll probably do Stays On separately because, in fact, I may not do it because it's a bugger to clean the stamps afterwards, to be really honest with you. And it's a copper ink, it's not going to be remotely comparable. But what I will say is it stamps brilliantly, but you need a special cleaner. You need to have the Stays On stamp cleaner, which I have heard people say, oh, you can't use that on rubber stamps, it damages them. It's actually codswallop. If you speak to a manufacturer of, sorry, you can't use it on clear stamps, it will damage them. It's complete nonsense. If you use it on clear stamps, nothing will happen as long as you wash it off like you're meant to. Manufacturers of clear stamps that have their own cleaners, which guess what, are probably bought from the same company. They're all manufactured by a separate company and then bottled by the ink companies. Probably exactly the same thing, but they just want you to buy theirs, not Stays-Ons. So if you already have Stays-On ink, you'll have the Stays-On cleaner because you kind of have to have it. It's stupid not to. So I'm using Archival in Jet Black, first of all. Oops. Already dropped something. We're doing really well here. It's important that you do little taps, as the incomparable Diane Reevely says, fairy footsteps, not fairy elephants. I'm probably going to get a halo because I just pressed really hard, forgetting, oh no, we're all right, forgetting that I'm working over foam, so you don't need to press quite so hard. So what I'm doing is I'm cleaning them off with a baby wipe and then a dried out baby wipe just to wipe it off. Next up is VersaFine, which is the fine detail ink from Sukaneko, which has this thing. I don't know whether you're meant to throw that away or not. I always keep it on there. And what you'll find with this is it stamps a real jet black. This colour is Onyx black. I love the brown, which I think is called sepia, some kind of variation on the theme of sepia, which I also love. I think it's a really, really lovely colour. What I find with it is often you can get a second stamp out of it sometimes without having to reload because it's so heavily pigmented and beautifully crisp image. Next up is VersaMagic, which is a chalk ink, and this is in Hint of Pesto, which is a lovely dark green. The only thing I don't like about these dewdrops is that the foam that they're on is really easy to press too hard with and end up covering the background of the stamp. And I'm also doing this one incorrectly. Oh no, it's come out all right. I was pressing down on the edges of the block, which you should never do. You should always press above the image. otherwise it rocks, and if you rock it, you know, you cause problems. Even though that's a green, it actually, in fine detail, can look quite brown. We'll look at them close up, obviously, when we get to the end of this really exciting run of me just stamping things. And the reason I decided to show you all the actual stamping process rather than just show you the finished result is that YouTube's current algorithm is favouring longer videos, so you're going to sit through this. I'm joking. Those of you who know me know I don't actually do this for profit. I do this for fun, and I couldn't give a shit about whether the algorithm favours my videos. I'm more interested in showing you the detail. So that was VersaCraft in Autumn Leaf. Now VersaCraft is more like a paint. It's like stamping with an acrylic gouache. It dries reasonably fast, and it sets like a gouache actually, but it can and does dry very quickly on your stamp, so you need to remove it pretty pronto, and I actually recommend washing your stamp. The problem with it is it's not good with fine detail. It's not designed for that. So now Brilliance in Graphite Black, which is advertised as a fast drying pigment ink from Soot. So they have basically variations on a theme. They've got a fast drying pigment ink, a fine detail pigment ink, a not fine detail pigment ink, and you start to wonder, do you need all of them? That's why I'm doing this, so you don't have to. It's not as intense black as VersaFine, but it picks up the fine detail beautifully, principally because it's not quite so dark, so you don't get quite so much darkness. So the people who love VersaFine for its clean, crisp images, if you've got images with a lot of fine detail, you might like Brilliance, and Brilliance does dry pretty quickly. It's just a pigment ink, there's nothing special about it. It's just a fine, quick drying one, and some of the Brilliance colours have pearlescence to them. The black is not one of them. They have either a pearlescence or a sparkle, as I remember. So I'm just using a new baby white because my old one had dried out, and I wanted to get as much of that off as I could. Right, now onto VersaColor in shade 82, which is black. And you might see quite a big difference between this and VersaFine, and you'll see why people use VersaFine. VersaColor is not good with fine detail. Although saying that, I bet that one's nearly perfect. You can also see there's a difference in the shades of black. That one's quite a yellow black, whereas VersaFine is a jet black, and Brilliance is pretty close too. That did all right in fine detail, but I find in general it doesn't do too well on the writing, but you'll see that later when I hold it up. So now Memento in Tuxedo Black, which I'm sure many of you have got because it's a lovely ink. And what I'll do in the video description is I'll link to all these products so that you can have exactly the ones I'm using, and I'll link to some useful colours in all of them, or if they have multi-packs with like dewdrops or cubes or something like that, and you can get a load of colours for 20 quid or $30 or something like that, where you can get 20 colours of ink, which I know the Memento ones do have. That's a really economical way of building up your stash without breaking the bank. And now finally Distress in Black Soot. And now Distress is not designed for stamping. Distress is designed for background inking and effects, not really for stamping. If you look at many of Tim Holtz's videos, he actually would do the stamping of the images in Archival and do the backgrounds in Distress, which works pretty well because Archival's oil-based and Distress is water-based, so they sit well with one another and they don't bleed. So I've done all of those, and I'm now going to move to using a clear stamp so that you can see how they work with clear stamps, bearing in mind that a lot of the water-based inks are not going to work too well with clear stamps because clear stamps generally don't. Now I'm going to prepare a stamp for you because I'm feeling uncommonly generous, and this is a set by Tribal. This is the Tribal Adventure set from Asylum. I bought it in the sale years ago and I've hardly used it, and I think I'm going to use this Never Stop Exploring stamp because it's got a fair bit of fine detail on it, And I'm going to mount that in the middle of a block, and before I use it, I'm going to go over it with StazOn Cleaner, just to remove any residual crap from the manufacturing process. Because when these things are manufactured, they're often very sticky, very hard to ink, and a little bit of StazOn Cleaner or soap and water will just get rid of that, but you must dry them really well. The other thing I usually do is I take an emery board, just a cheap one, and I just go over, again, it just gets rid of any rubbish that's still on them from the manufacturing process. But you need to baby wipe it wet and dry to get rid of it. And don't do it too hard because you will damage the image. I don't think I've ever damaged the image though, it's just a warning. So let's start with Archival. Archival stamps pretty well with a clear image. And there is a trick if you're struggling to get clear stamps to really work well with dye-based, water-based dye inks, is to put Archival on the stamp and leave it to dry. Sorry, put Archival on the stamp it onto paper once, and then let whatever's left on the stamp just dry out. And once it's dry, that gives purchase to the surface. That can help you to get a better image with dye-based inks, so I'm told, as can wiping a bit of glycerine over it just before you stamp. But I have, to be honest, I have not managed to get those techniques to work with this really cheap Craft Asylum crappy set. I don't think Craft Asylum are a great manufacturer myself. I think their stuff is, their photopolymer stamps are particularly low quality. Sorry, Craft Asylum, just ruining your business there, but, you know, make better stamps. They're the kind that when you get them really smell, and you just know they're not going to give you a really crisp image. It's really hard to get anything good. So we're on to VersaMagic now, and at this point I could actually do the rest without speaking to you and just put this into fast motion. Maybe I will when I edit it, I don't know yet, I've not decided. It depends if anything interesting happens, like if I make a schoolboy error, I will want to keep them in. One thing I'll say about VersaMagic and other chalk inks, aka hybrid inks, is they're not so great on the fine detail. VersaCraft will not be good on fine detail because it's basically paint. And you know, you can stamp with watercolour, you can stamp with watercolour pens, you can stamp with gouache, you can stamp with acrylic paint. People like Lindsay the Frugal Crafter, who do a lot of mixed media, stamp with acrylic paint quite often. It's not something I really do, because the acrylics I have tend to be the artist quality, really heavy body ones, whereas you need quite a soft acrylic for that kind of thing, really. I mean, you can just dilute them down, it's not a big deal. Now, I haven't really done a totally fair test because the stamp I was using on that side didn't have any really big areas of any solid areas to really compare with how well solid areas work on photopolymer, but I will tell you from past experience, these all stamp absolutely equivalent. If they can't stamp well on fine detail, they won't stamp well on a solid area, and vice versa. So I'm not overly concerned. Memento. I love Memento, I really do. They have lovely colours, they're economical, but they are shit on polymer stamps. They just always go blotchy. Now I know there's those wonderful inks that are available in the USA from Simon Says Stamp and Hero Arts that go on blotchy and then they spread out when they're drying, and they are so hard to get hold of in the UK. Unless you go to really specialist websites that charge a fortune, or you get them imported via US Amazon. Really frustrates me that we can't get them over here quite so easily, that they're really not available, they're not in our shops, we can't get them in a big box craft store. Really, really annoying. So let's bring these up to the camera and we'll have a look. I'm going to go sideways because of where the tripod is. So Archival has stamped beautifully. Got lovely fine detail here. That's a little bit blurred, but that's my fault for rocking it. But the fine detail of the actual insects is really good. So I am going to buy all the colours of Archival for that reason alone, that they stamp so prettily. The next one here is VersaFine, which is pretty good. It's a little bit crap on the writing. It's a pigment ink, so it's sitting on the paper, whereas Archival is in the paper, which I think you can see. It's pretty good. VersaMagic, the chalk ink, has actually come out surprisingly well. I really like that actually, but it's similar to a pigment ink. It just lacks the kind of perfection, but it's great if you're going for a slightly more vintage look. VersaCraft is crap, but that's because it's a paint ink. It's not really designed to work on a fine detailed image. Brilliance is brilliant, and I really like how it works on the fine detail, especially on that one. It's got a lovely vintage effect on the middle one that you don't get with VersaFine. That's stamped pretty solidly, whereas this one's given a bit more detail, so I quite like it for that. This is VersaColor, which is a little bit more splotchy on the solider areas, not so good on the fine detail. Memento, absolutely fine. It's done all right. It's always good on rubber. And Distress, actually, even though it's not designed for it, will stamp pretty well on rubber. Where we have a problem is when we start to go into photopolymer. So here we have Archival, which is not perfect. You can see that's got some blotchiness to it. VersaFine has got rid of some of that blotchiness, but it covered up some of the writing, as did VersaMagic. VersaCraft is just a joke. Brilliance is actually probably the best of them so far, for both having the white writing and the solid area look good. This is VersaColor, which again actually has worked pretty well, but that's a pigment ink, of course. Memento is a little bit blotchy. You can see that Memento is not perfect, and Distress is really not perfect. So my evaluation really is that, apart from VersaCraft, which is a joke for this kind of work, I think they're all pretty good for... Oh, sorry, forgot you were out of focus there. I think these have all come out pretty well, apart from VersaCraft. I think if you want a chalk ink that gives you a slightly less perfect effect, VersaMagic is pretty good. Dries reasonably fast. I think VersaFine if you want a really sharp black pigment ink. Archival if you want a dye ink. I think that's really one of the best dye inks there is. And the colours that now comes in are beautiful. And I don't have any yet. Memento is just not quite so crisp, but you can colour over it, and hey, that'll do. And Distress, of course, will reactivate with moisture, so you can't stamp over it. But they're great on red rubber. On photopolymer, and this is a really low-end photopolymer, I have to say, Archival is not great. I think VersaFine, is pigment ink. It's always going to sit on top of the paper and look very different. VersaFine or Brilliance or VersaColor as pigment inks all did really well. Memento and Distress as dye inks, and Archival as a dye ink did pretty badly. So until I can get my hands on some of those lovely inks you guys have in the USA, so if anyone is out there from Hero Arts or Simon Says Stamp and would like me to review your products, I would actually love to review these inks to find out what's so special with them and how they function. The chemistry of these inks is pretty important, so let me whiz through that. Archival is solvent based, and when you heat set it or leave it to dry, the solvent evaporates and this stays there. And I could go over that with Distress now and it would stay there. Distress being water based, that will stay there. VersaFine is pigment based, so that's fine. It's a solid pigment sitting on the image, as are most of these. I mean, VersaCraft is a paint, that's going to take longer to dry. VersaMagic dries pretty well. Brilliance dries pretty well. VersaColor, slow drying, really slow drying, and it's easy to smear it. Memento is dye based, but it's water based, so you can't use water based colours over it, and Distress you can't use water based colours over it. So just to prove a point, I'm going to take some Distress ink in Evergreen Bow, which is a light green, and I'm going to go over this column and we'll just see what smears and what doesn't. Well, do you know, I'm actually pleasantly surprised by that. Distress has moved, as has Memento, which is what you expect. VersaColor's moved a bit. Brilliance has moved quite a bit, actually. These two have moved. These ones have actually stayed pretty still. You could probably get away with using it over most of these, but I wouldn't use it over Memento or Distress itself, because Distress and Distress equals blur. Distress is not meant to be gone over with Distress ink. It's meant to blur. Brilliance has blurred because it hasn't dried yet. It's a really slow drying one. It's meant to be quick drying, but slow drying compared to dye inks, I guess I mean. VersaColor, again, much the same. If I were to go over them with a water brush, you'll get... This water brush is not clean. This water brush is dirty. Okay, you can see Distress has really lifted up there. Can you see that? Yes, you can. Distress has really lifted up. Memento has really lifted up, but the others are pretty much okay. I don't know why that water brush is so filthy. Ugh. If I were to go over them with an alcohol marker, I don't have one to hand. I've got a colourless blender for alcohol markers here. Distress doesn't move. Memento we know doesn't move because we use that quite often. VersaColor moves. Brilliance really moves. VersaCraft moves a bit, but not too much. VersaMagic moves, so VersaFine is okay, and Archival we know is okay. So Archival, Memento, and to an extent Distress are okay with alcohol. Brilliance, VersaCraft, and VersaMagic are not okay with alcohol. So I hope that helps. I'll put a table on my website in the coming week where you can download that gives you a summary of the properties of these inks, and of course there are many others out there. This is not exhaustive. This is not even exhaustive of what I have, because I've got all sorts of own brand store ones, and I've got all of the VersaMarks, which are the watermarking inks, which we can use for embossing. There's a whole range of those. There's not just the clear one, there's 2 colours as well. I think I'll summarise these on my website at some point in the future, but I'll link to all the products I've used today in the video description, which includes the block and the 2 stamp sets that I've used, the inks, and some other inks in those ranges that you might find useful, and the pen, just in case anyone's interested, is the Dilutions paint pen. The reason I used that is because it was there on my table, so I picked it up. There's no real reason for using that, and I have to say I really like this pen. I'm having to be careful to not use it too much because it comes in a set of 2, and they work out about £4, so $6 each, and I don't want to waste it. But it's great fun because you can doodle and it dries almost instantly. But because it's paint, you can go over. I mean, VersaCraft is paint. I can go over paint and it will stay there. I can go over chalk. I can go over Archival or even VersaFine or anything else, and they don't move, and it can write on all of them. So that's another point actually. Dilutions paint pens will write over the top of all of these if you need them to. So here's my little quick tip on stamping supplies and how they compare with each other, which might help you a little bit if you're just getting started in card making, mixed media or scrapbooking. Thank you all very much and good evening.